Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sounds of Science, a series of podcasts hosted by EUCOPE, the European trade body representing small and mid-sized companies active in health technologies. My name is Stefano Romanelli, and I am Government Affairs Associate Director at EUCOPE. Today, we are diving into a fundamental topic, the competitiveness of the EU life sciences sector. We will explore key findings from a report that EUCOPE commissioned to Copenhagen Economics and that we are launching today. In this report, over 10 key legislative initiatives are analyzed to understand their impact on the competitiveness of the innovative life sciences sector. Before moving forward, we'd like to kindly ask you to click on the subscribe button for our podcast and follow us on LinkedIn to stay up to date on all of the latest news and initiatives within the world of European life sciences. Hello, in this episode we present the report titled Competitiveness of the EU Life Sciences Sector, Analysis of the Impact of Current and Future EU Legislations on the Competitiveness of the EU Life Sciences Sector. The paper assesses the impact of a number of key EU legislations on capacity to innovate, cost of compliance, international competitiveness, and market access. Joining us are today Julia Wahl, partner at Copenhagen Economics.
Hello, nice to see you.
Andrea Bonetti, head of EU Office for Global Public Affairs at Chiesi.
Hi, nice meeting you.
And Lotte Bruns, head of Public Affairs at Orion Pharma.
Hello, also from the Nordics.
So we will start with Julia sharing some of the main insights of the report, and then Andrea and Lotte will join the discussion, sharing some expertise and insights from the pharmaceutical sector perspective and commenting these legislations. Julia, let's just jump right in, and could you briefly walk us through this report? What are the main gaps you identified, and how do you see the connection of the report that you have been working on with the recent Draghi report and the competitiveness compass of the Commission?
Well, that's of course a tall order, summarizing such a comprehensive report in a few words, but let me give it a try. In a nutshell, our report examines the impact of 10 major EU legislative initiatives on the competitiveness of the life sciences sector, along 4 key dimensions that you already mentioned, Stefano: capacity to innovate, cost of compliance, international competitiveness, and market access. The first 3 of those dimensions are the key principles outlined in the Commission's competitiveness check, which we got inspired by. And then we've added to that market access as another 4th dimension, because the ease with which companies can access markets and the size of the markets they can access is also key to their competitiveness, of course, and their commercial performance. Our analysis looks at legislations that are already applied, such as the European Health Data Space, the HTA regulation, the GMO framework. It looks at legislations that are still at a proposal stage, for instance, the General Pharmaceutical Legislation, Critical Medicines Act, the Patent Package, and it also looks at anticipated legislations such as the Biotech Act. And we also cover broader developments around sustainability legislations impacting the sector. We don't look at those individually, but all together as sort of a group of key legislations. And we basically conducted an in-depth analysis of each of those legislations that were in scope of the exercise, relying on the peer-reviewed and grey literature. And we added to that interviews with a selection of EUCOPE member companies to just give us a better flavor of the on-the-ground reality dealing with those legislations. So what have we found? Well, I think it's pretty clear that the EU life sciences sector is at a crossroads. While we have in Europe a rich history of scientific excellence and innovation, our analysis in this report shows that the EU must really urgently reform its regulatory landscape to boost the global competitiveness of its life sciences sector and boost innovation. In other words, the EU still has some way to go to fulfill the ambitions that the Draghi report, which I'll come back to in a minute, has spelled out for this sector. I just want to briefly break this down along the dimensions I mentioned earlier. So first, we find that the EU has not yet sufficiently seized the opportunity to improve capacity to innovate. And by capacity to innovate, we mean the sector's ability to translate scientific research into market-ready innovation. Overall, actually several of the legislations that we looked at explicitly aimed to boost the sector's capacity to innovate, but we find that their actual impact is likely to be quite mixed. For instance, the Commission's General Pharmaceutical Legislation proposal introduces measures to enhance regulatory efficiency, such as the hopefully shorter approval timelines or regulatory sandboxes. But these positive steps are then offset by a reduction in baseline regulatory data protection, for instance, which dampens investment incentives. Another example is that the efforts to reduce fragmentation and enhance harmonization across EU member states, such as under the Clinical Trials Regulation or the EU Health Technology Assessment Regulation, have really fallen short of their ambitions and instead have resulted in what we call a consolidation of diverse national requirements into one single, more complex, more burdensome process. And they therefore do not really improve, but in the worst case, actually hinder the sector's capacity to bring innovations to the market quickly. Secondly, we find that the cost of compliance has substantially increased and will continue to do so under the legislations that we have looked at. We've seen an overall expansion of monitoring, reporting, documentation requirements, a continued risk of duplication between EU and national level processes, and also overlaps and inconsistencies between regulations that, of course, further drive complexity for companies. Third, when we look at international competitiveness, we actually find that the EU, through the legislation, might not be able to close the widening international competitiveness gap that we all perceive. In the report, international competitiveness we define that in two ways. Firstly, we refer to the ability of EU-based companies to compete successfully on global markets in terms of innovation, investment, the market shares they achieve. But we also assess the international competitiveness of the EU regulatory framework itself. So how attractive is it as a location for developing and launching medicines and medical devices? Overall, we find that the current legislative landscape, taken as a whole, is not really sufficient to close that international competitiveness gap. And that's because we have those many sources of complexity and the high compliance costs that I mentioned earlier, which could push companies really away from operating and investing in Europe. And of course, this combined with, some pull factors that we're currently seeing from the US, such as tariffs, MFN pricing, that could put the European footprint of the life sciences sector at risk and reduce its economic contribution, which is something that we don't want. Moreover, compared to other regions, Europe's markets continues to be quite complex and fragmented. That has always been the European story, and it continues to be so despite some harmonization efforts. And with now even lower baseline incentives than before. So that means that we have a comparatively higher regulatory burden, weakened incentives, and also environmental impact legislations that further add to that regulatory complexity. Finally, when we look at market access, we assessed specifically whether the current legislation somehow impact the speed at which companies' innovations can reach the market, whether they improve or even aggravate complexity of market access procedures, and whether they also might affect expected revenues at launch. And these factors, in turn, of course, influence companies' incentives to prioritize launching in Europe. And what we find is that the provisions like the EU HTA regulation and the EU GPL explicitly aim to improve and accelerate market access to the EU, but we really have some doubts about their ability to deliver on this ambition because of the potential duplication between EU level and national level reviews under the EU HTA, and also the lack of effective provisions to assess because of the lack of effective provisions to really address the root causes of access delays that we have in the EU and that are really multifaceted. Stefano, you also asked me, what's the reference to the Draghi report, the competitive compass, etc. So I just want to comment on that. The Draghi report was released last year, and it warned that the EU is already lagging behind in pharmaceutical innovation due to a fragmented and complex regulatory system. It called for Europe to radically change. In life sciences, this meant 9 proposals, which I think imply 3 things broadly. First, regulatory simplification and reduction of market fragmentation. Second, more focused public and private research and innovation investments, in particular to support innovation hubs. and also ATMP development. And then third, leveraging EU health data and the possibilities of artificial intelligence in the fullest. The competitiveness compass basically sets out then a strategic roadmap of how to get there through similar channels, similar ambitions, simplifying regulations, ensuring sufficient financing, skill promotion, coordination of policies, etc. So both initiatives really emphasize this need for a more unified, more ambitious, and more simplified, harmonized approach to regulation and to boosting innovation. And our report really echoes these calls and provides also some concrete evidence that without urgent actions on the specific legislations that we examine, we risk really aggravating and not improving the situation for Europe. If I may, a personal comment, I also think that at a deeper level, the Draghi report goes to the heart of some of the fundamental challenges that we need to address in Europe, both about the ways we finance innovation and about the ways we shape our research and development ecosystems beyond just the regulatory framework. So this is more about the collaboration between researchers, investors, industry, our ability to build clusters, etc. And these are some further big challenges that come on top of regulatory simplification that we have ahead of us.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the thorough presentation of the report. It was not easy also because it's a detailed report and it's difficult to summarize it. And I think it's also interesting to see the connection between this report and current initiatives that are taking place at the EU level to try to boost competitiveness of the EU generally and specifically of the pharma sector. Before going into the details of the report and see a bit more the impact on the various aspects you mentioned, I would ask Andrea and Lotte if they have some initial comments or reflections on the report generally and what you just shared with us. Andrea, do you want to go first?
Hey, thanks, Stefano, and thanks, Julia, for presenting the report. I think it's really interesting, and as Chiesi, we share like the main, let's say, assessment about this critical concern, which is that a lot of EU health related initiatives have not delivered yet on their original ambitions, especially when it comes to streamlining, harmonizing processes across member states and EU. And I think it's also not a case that if you look at the executive summary with all the table, with all the files, the only, let's say, green one, so where you still have a lot of opportunities, is the Biotech Act, which is the only one that hasn't been published yet. So I think this is really showing that there is still in Europe an untapped potential for the life science sector, but we really need to seize now this opportunity and make sure that we can deliver on the ambition and that diluting over time in the complex legislative process that characterizes Europe, all the different elements that can be brought to improve really the competitiveness of the life science sector in Europe.
Thank you, Andrea. And Lotte, any initial reaction on your side?
Very much echoing. Good morning, everyone. Julia and Andrea, as a representative of a Nordic mid-sized company, we've been growing the past years very heavily on R&D, and all of these legislative procedures are a key interest to us. But I would like to kind of step back and really to talk about what are the legislations for. And from the pharma perspective, as we all know that the life cycle from early discovery to the patient is a long one. It's 10 to 15 years. There is still to be seen what happens with the current legislation. Like Julia said, that it's untapped potential. And if we simplify from the pharma perspective, I would say that for us, legislation plays part in three of the main kind of things. It's about attracting, whether it's pull or push effect on getting capital, whether it's the monetary or human capital into the local markets, accelerating. It's about the speed that we've been talking about here already now. And then the access, the reward of innovation. And we know that Europe has had challenges. Only half of the new molecules gets to the patients. So it's hard not to agree what was said yet. And pharma business is a global business. So we're looking at where in the world it is interesting to and profitable to invest in.
Thanks. And we will deep dive at these topics in a bit. But I will go back to Julia first and to start hearing a bit about some more insights of the report, and starting with the assessment on the capacity to innovate. As you mentioned earlier, Julia, the report finds that the EU has not seized yet the opportunity to improve capacity to innovate. Based on the findings you had in the report, what are the key legislative bottlenecks that are holding back innovation in Europe?
I'm also, of course, curious to hear what Andrea and Lotte would think the main ones are, but I can certainly share what I think the main issues are. I think the first one is the main economic incentives for innovation in the EU regulatory framework. So by that, I mean IP and other protection tools that confer innovative treatments, time-limited protection from generic or biosimilar competition. Those have been weakened. As I said earlier, the general pharmaceutical legislation is likely to end with a reduction of baseline protection periods, which boils down to a reduction of effective protection lengths for many innovative treatments. We also know that, extensions can be earned through so-called modulation. You can earn an extension above that baseline if your medicinal products meet certain conditions, such as, for instance, addressing unmet medical need. But these conditions are in part quite narrowly defined, and it's also quite difficult to predict as a company, as an investor, whether a certain product will ultimately meet those conditions and benefit from those extensions. So the additional years of protection you may achieve, they do not really count towards the investment case when investment decisions are made. I think it's really quite a missed opportunity that instead of really trying and stepping up on incentives to make sure that Europe can compete in the most risky, also the most high value cutting edge segments, for instance, ATMPs, we've actually taken an approach to reduce baselines and then add a quite complex modulation system on top of that. The second issue I'd like to highlight is this continued fragmentation and the regulatory burdens we perceive with the clinical trial regulations and the HTA regulation. Both regulations had this intention to harmonize and streamline fragmented landscapes across 27 EU member states. In case of the CTR, through a single submission portal and a unified review process across Europe. In case of the EU HTA regulation, through a EU-level joint clinical assessment. The goal here really was to attract more clinical trials to Europe and to reduce the efforts that companies need to access EU markets. But our analysis really shows that both legislations fall short of their potential, because really, as I said earlier, instead of truly harmonizing and simplifying, they are at the moment just consolidating the diverse requirements of 27 member states into a single, more complex, more burdensome process at EU level. And this is really quite a missed opportunity. The third issue, if I may, that I'd like to highlight sits with those safety-related legislations, because not all legislations that we looked at intended to boost capacity to innovate. Some also have very important safety-related objectives. So they're not as such meant to increase capacity to innovate, but they also should not disproportionately restrict it. And here we really find that those legislations have overall led to slower and more unpredictable regulatory pathways. As an example, the medical device regulation, in vitro device regulation, they were introduced to strengthen the safety, quality, transparency of medical devices and diagnostic tools. But compared to their predecessors, these regulations have really led to slower and more unpredictable regulations. I think today the time required to complete the relevant technical certifications is 6 to 12 months, and the notified bodies across the EU, so the bodies that deal with the conformity assessments in the member states, they vary quite a lot in the interpretation of compliance standards. And this is particularly impactful if we consider that devices have to undergo a renewal of certification every 3 to 5 years. Otherwise, they can't stay on the market. So this is just maybe one tangible example of how safety-related legislations just impose quite a burden where we could think, can we design that in a different way such that we make it less burdensome for companies?
Thank you, Julia. Maybe building on your comments and from company perspective, how do you see indeed the impact of these EU regulations on the ability of your company to invest, especially in high-risk innovation areas like orphan drugs, but even generally? Can you share some concrete examples or some concrete reflections on how this legislation impacted companies? Lotte, do you want to go first?
Yes. I think I kind of rushed into that already last my reply, but I said the life cycle of innovation is so long that it's really hard to tell right away what are the outcomes. We are yet to be seen at what happens. But those issues that Julia just mentioned, as we all know, in innovative medicines, the IPR rights are the baseline of everything. But when we look at the whole picture, when the company does the decision, it's the entire value chain that needs to be attractive, not one single legislation does it. It's the whole package that we are evaluating. And then things like you said, simplifying pace, but also I think that understanding of the role of legislation, and we have seen in the past years this kind of horizontal legislation, the increase of it, and lack of impact analysis of those also to our sector. So I would say that it's really understanding and the variety of issues that impact us, and also the fact that I said earlier, we are in a global business and it's a global fierce competition that we as in Europe have to take upon.
Thanks, Lotte. And Andrea, would you like to add some?
Yeah, thanks. I fully agree with Lotte. And if I look at legislation such as the EUHTA, the clinical trial, or even the review of the EU pharmaceutical laws, even if they are not finalized yet, I think we can say that they are meant to improve collaboration among countries, reduce or even avoid duplicative assessments, accelerate the regulatory processes, and incentivize investments in areas of unmet medical need. But ultimately, these reforms are expected to enhance patient access to innovative therapies, and by doing so, overall also strengthening the EU competitiveness and attractiveness in life sciences. But I think yet the progress is really uneven. If I think about proposals that are still under negotiations or that are in the early phases of implementation, such as the HTA, there is quite some uncertainty around the impact that they will have in making the EU really more attractive. So as Chiesi, we are a global biopharmaceutical company. We are deeply rooted in Europe. We have a strong European footprint in terms of R&D and manufacturing. And going back to also your original question, I think we can say we continue to invest in high value innovation areas such as orphan drugs or ATMPs, because we want to deliver therapies for people living with different diseases, including rare and ultra rare ones. But I think what the message for us is also that maintaining the status quo at best is no longer sufficient. And in today's geopolitical context, where really biotechnologies are strategic assets that countries are also actively competing over, Europe must decide now if it wants to still be relevant and influential in the life science sector.
Thanks, Andrea. And I think both of you have mentioned something that we will touch upon in a second, also the situation vis-a-vis global competitor and the competitiveness at the international level of the EU. And before moving to that, I want to mention quickly another aspect that the report assesses and that we also hinted to is the increased cost of compliance for companies that these new regulations have sometimes led, even though initially they were meant to harmonize and reduce costs. So maybe without going too much into details, because we have somehow already touched on that, Julia, would you like to share some of the insights on this from the report?
Yeah, happy to. I think really the main takeaway from the report is that compliance costs have nearly increased across the board. And that is, I think, the difficulty. It's the cumulative impact of all of these individual legislations. But to give you just a few examples of what we found, I mean, I think interestingly for the HTA regulation, the estimates at the time, given the harmonization ambition, was that the submission of a single dossier for HTA at the EU level could potentially reduce administrative costs associated with the previous multiple national HTA by as much as 70%. But what we see today is that this continued possibility of additional national assessments combined with very little support and dialogues with companies that this really undermines these savings and could even lead, at least in the short run, to an increase of administrative costs. Another example is the CTR, so the clinical trial regulation, where the administrative burdens have really dramatically increased. Documents per submission, which is an interesting indicator to think about, compliance costs have increased from around 200 to between 330 and 800. And that's just because of an increase in legal and procedural documentation requirements in the new system. So just two very interesting examples of on-the-ground impacts here. Really, compliance costs have increased across the board, and it's the cumulative impact that really matters.
Thanks, Julia. And I think if you read the report, you will find even more examples, but these are quite indicative of the situation. And Andrea, going back to you also to the point that you made of these attempts to improve harmonization or to create a better environment, which at the end turned in staying with the status quo or even making it worse. Can you elaborate a bit more on how these attempts at the end have paradoxically increased complexity or, not reached the desired effect, even though the initial scope was positive and in the right direction?
Yeah, thanks. And as Julia said, I think that if we look at the overall picture, indeed the compliance costs have increased, especially in the initial phase when you need to analyze a legislative proposal, understand the impact on your, let's say, organization, and how then to operationalize all the processes to make sure that you will be compliant in the end. But if I look at a specific case like the clinical trial regulation, where we have gathered some experience so far, as you said, Stefano, I think it's not that the overall complexity has necessarily increased, but what we see is that the expected simplification and efficiencies have not yet materialized. So again, despite the original objective of simplifying trials across Europe in different countries, what we see now in these initial phases, in any case, or up to now, there is some inconsistencies in the way it is applied and interpreted by national authorities, and how the ethics committees work. And these then are leading in practice to delays in the trial approvals, to conflicting requirements for multi-country studies, and also in quite some complexity if you need to manage, let's say, changes to the protocols of the trials. Again, what we see is that this regulation was also supposed to, in a way, centralize and reduce the number of information you need to provide, working with the member states only, but then we still receive a lot of separate requests for informations that usually have also very short timelines to reply. So again, this is an example of something that in theory is not, let's say, necessarily adding complexity, but it's not also delivering on the simplification. It's not adding complexity compared to the previous system, but it's not delivering on the simplification that is needed to keeping Europe competitive with the also outside world.
Thanks, Andrea. That's quite illustrative of issues that companies face nowadays. Lotte, would you like to add something else, some other examples or some other issues that you face?
Yeah, very similar issues that we are kind of seeing with the clinical trials regulation now when we're 3 years into it. I think the overall intention was really good to get all the harmonization, etc. However, the impact has turned out to be a bit different. Andrea already mentioned the ethics committee. This was something also brought up in our company in the conversation, that it really requires additional work and on that. And couldn't agree more on the number of regulation that we in general get, that the understanding their impact within the company requires more effort than collecting the data, then doing necessary work to be compliant, and then reporting. So the whole process requires new skills, number of people, etc. But going back to the clinical trials, I think the ACT EU, the target of, is it called Target 500, to get more clinical trials to Europe. We see these kind of initiatives really good. But at the same time, that when we try to harmonize all of these, we see also single countries doing pitches within Europe and offering different things, trying to pull that one. So at the same time, when the harmonization is happening, there's also single markets. And I think that in the past year, there has been a lot of progress, but there is still much to do in order us to get the whole 27 countries to work as one.
Thank you, Lotte. I think one of the key words here is simplification, and hopefully it's something that we will see in one of the upcoming acts, the Biotech Act. And another important aspect, especially when we think of clinical trials or R&D investment, is something that we have been mentioning earlier. It's the international competitiveness of the EU in comparison to other countries, but also the challenges that now we are facing at the EU level, thinking of other global policy that international companies, especially EU-based companies, have to face. So maybe what do you see as needed actions and reforms to try to close the gap or to make the EU more competitive at global level? Julia, do you want to start also sharing some of the insights from the report?
Of course. And maybe it doesn't come as a surprise that one of the main insights of the report is indeed simplifying, harmonizing, aligning regulatory frameworks in the EU, reducing administrative burdens. That will really be one of the key ingredients to a recipe that will allow us to close this competitiveness gap. I think without such reforms that Draghi also underlined are really necessary, the EU risks reinforcing negative trends such as slower clinical trial timelines, declining research and development investments compared to other regions like the US and China. I think Draghi put it quite eloquently in his September 2025 speech, reflecting on sort of 1 year after his report, saying that competitors in the US and China are far less constrained than their European counterparts, even when acting within the law. I think, though, that the law, of course, can only do so much. And Draghi also pointed out that we need to also improve the way we finance innovation and the way we leverage data and AI. And I see in this respect both the European Health Data Space Regulation and the Biotech Act as having really the potential to strengthen the EU and the ecosystem and make us more competitive globally. But of course, the success really depends on the effective implementation.
Thanks, Julia. And I would expand the same questions to Andrea and Lotte to also hear a bit of company perspective. Andrea, would you like to go first?
Thanks. And I don't want to repeat what was already said. And I also believe that both in the report that we are discussing today and in the Draghi report as well, there are a lot of suggestions that can be implemented. But I believe that if we are serious in trying to address at least this competitiveness gap, we need to work on a combination of factors, because first of all, we have an ecosystem in front of us. So it's not just about pharmaceutical companies, but it's really making sure that the entire life science ecosystem is really attractive and thriving. And on the other hand, you have also, let's say, competencies that are shared between the European level, very few, and the national one that is, quite relevant when it comes to health. So I believe that we need to work on both these two streams. On the one hand, you need to make sure that what is decided in Brussels, and not just around the healthcare, but also in terms of investments, opportunities, availability of financial tools, prioritization in areas of R&D, the future budget. You are really working, keeping in mind that the shared objective, in our view, should be how can we enhance or enable at least faster access for patients to innovative treatments. On the other hand, you also need to work at the national level to make sure there is a market for innovative products, and that countries are willing to invest and consider health as an investment and not just as a cost. Because you could have the perfect policy framework and no market, and then so still struggling in attracting investments and keeping Europe competitive. On the other hand, you could have like perfect market, but no or like a regulatory system, a policy framework that is not fit for purpose, and there like investments will again be suboptimal. I believe that there is not just one single regulation that you can tweak and change at European level, and then suddenly Europe will be back to the competitiveness level it had 25 years ago. But I do believe that Europe, in any case, has the talent and the science. And in the case of rare diseases, you also have some unique opportunities like the European reference network that can be a source, especially for R&D projects and research. The point is really, do we have the ambition and the commitment then to deliver on that ambition to be again, let's say, competitive in this global context? And so I believe that what is needed is really a coherent strategy where we try to remove the barriers when it comes to implementation, as Julia was saying, and the other example that we mentioned beforehand. And we really also work in rewarding innovation.
Thanks, Andrea. I'd like to reiterate these points that you made, especially about the need of a holistic approach. And Lotte, would you like to add anything?
It's very hard to add on the top of these, but I would like to almost like repeat what I said in the beginning, that it's a holistic approach that we need. And perhaps rather than looking at one single regulation, let's think about what we do with the regulation. Unfortunately, in Europe, we don't have that many tools that in some of the biggest countries, like when they are single market and they have taxation rights and all of that. So we need to be even more mindful when we utilize different tools. But in general, I think that it's about the attracting. We talked about the incentives, whether they are the IPR rights or capital or human competencies. And I think that Europe has a really good and sound base for that. And then it's about the acceleration of everything. Andrea mentioned that ambition, do we really want to do it? And the urgency that we need to do it now, the pace, what we're seeing with the current legislation, when they come, they're almost late. And recognizing these horizontal legislations, for example, a role of AI in the future, pharmaceutical, quantum physics, all of that play also a pivotal role in our future, and trying to avoid that fragmentation while accelerate. But in the end of the day, we're in a business where we need to see the reward for the innovation. That needs to happen as well. What it means is also the recognizing that at the center there needs to be the patient that receives something, and we're covering these unmet medical needs of the future and current diseases. So it's a holistic approach that we all need to do it. And I would say the ecosystem, public-private partners, it's getting also companies to be part of the legislative processes, because we know what the reality is here. It's good to get these, as I said earlier, impact analyses earlier than later. We've seen some of the rush regulation that have to be now reopened and reassessed. So overall, if we regulate, let's make better regulation.
Thanks, Lotte. No, I can only agree, and I think it's quite important also to think about the impact of a legislation, which might be different from another health legislation specifically, but it can have a lot of impact. Also linking to something you mentioned, the importance to, at the end of the day, ensure patient access to therapies, we can move to the last point that we analyzed in our report. So the impact of legislation in market access. It's a bit of an horizontal analysis. And I would like to ask you all, how do you see the impact of existing legislations, and particularly the UHTA regulation, but also the ongoing revision of the Pharma legislation and the Critical Medicines Act to impact the actually market access landscape? And on the other hand, what is the role of member states on market access? I would start with Julia and then go back to Lotte and Andrea.
All right. Large question, Stefano. Thanks. So maybe to start with the HTA